It began as a tightly controlled private meeting inside palace walls, where reports suggest the atmosphere shifted the moment Queen Camilla began to speak. For weeks, insiders had whispered about a brewing confrontation between the old guard and the new domestic circle surrounding the king. But no one expected Princess Anne, iron-willed and unmoved, to rise from her chair and walk out before the room could recover from the silence. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, those inside the room reportedly tried to pretend nothing had happened. That is how the palace survives moments of danger. A cough, a lowered glance, a paper moved across the table, a silent attempt to bury the shock before it could become a story. But this was not a misplaced remark or a small disagreement over ceremony. This meeting, according to palace whispers, had been called to discuss something far more sensitive: household authority, royal protocol, and the future balance of power around King Charles. For years, Princess Anne has been seen as one of the monarchy's strongest pillars, a woman who does not waste words, does not chase approval, and does not mistake noise for duty. She has spent decades carrying the weight of the crown with discipline, restraint, and a loyalty that often speaks louder than affection. So when Camilla allegedly began speaking on matters Anne believed crossed a private boundary, the reaction was not loud. It was worse. It was controlled. It was cold. It was final. Those close to the household claim Camilla's comments were tied to influence inside the king's inner circle, touching on how decisions should be shaped, who should be consulted, and where certain lines of royal authority should now fall. To some, it may have sounded like ordinary administration. To Anne, insiders suggest it sounded like interference. And in a family where every gesture carries meaning, Anne's decision to stand up was not simply a response. It was a message. Aides were said to be stunned because Anne rarely displays emotion in institutional settings. She has endured scandal, grief, pressure, and public storms without giving the watching world the satisfaction of seeing her shaken. Yet this time, she did not argue. She did not demand the floor. She did not create a spectacle. She simply removed herself. And somehow that silence became louder than any accusation could have been. King Charles, according to those familiar with the moment, appeared visibly strained as the room froze around him. It was the kind of tension no monarch wants to face, because it does not come from outside the palace gates. It comes from within the family itself. Prince William reportedly watched in silence, understanding that Anne's exit was not impulsive, not theatrical, and not careless. It was symbolic, and everyone in that room knew it. But what looked like a single cold gesture was, according to palace whispers, the first visible crack in a much larger struggle over influence, loyalty, and the future command of the crown. Various interpretations of that meeting now suggest it was never meant to become dramatic. It was supposed to be administrative, quiet, controlled a discussion about schedules, household access, and the delicate reshaping of duties while King Charles remained physically vulnerable. But behind the polished language of palace management, insiders whisper that one question hung heavily over the table. Who truly had the right to speak for the monarchy when the king's strength was divided? That question, once spoken only in careful tones behind closed doors, had reportedly begun to disturb the very people who understood the crown best. King Charles' health challenges had already placed the institution in a fragile position, not because the monarchy lacked structure, but because every structure becomes more exposed when the person at the center is forced to lean on others. Duties had to be adjusted, access had to be managed, messages had to be filtered. And in those quiet adjustments, courtiers allegedly began to notice something they could no longer ignore. Influence was becoming power, and power was becoming personal. Camilla's household, according to palace whispers, had grown more visible in the daily rhythm around the king. What may have started as support, loyalty, and practical care was allegedly viewed by some senior royals as something more complicated. Not a coup, not a rebellion, but a subtle shift in the temperature of authority. Who entered first? Who received briefings? Who shaped the king's attention before others could reach him? In royal life, these small details are never small for long. They become signals. And signals become warnings. Princess Anne, insiders suggest, understood that danger better than most. Her loyalty has never depended on closeness, comfort, or personal favour. It has always been rooted in duty, in the old belief that the monarchy survives only when private feelings are forced to bow before public responsibility. To Anne, royal authority was not something to be softened by emotional circles or guided by domestic preference. It belonged to the institution. It belonged to service. It belonged to the crown itself. And if anyone appeared to blur that line, even unintentionally, Anne would not need to raise her voice to make her position known. Prince Edward and Prince William were reportedly aware of the unease building beneath the surface. Edward, long accustomed to watching storms form slowly within the family, allegedly recognized the discomfort before it turned sharp. William, meanwhile, understood the future implications. For him, this was not only about the present king, it was about the shape of the monarchy he would one day inherit. If authority could be pulled into private circles now, what would be left for the next reign? What rules would remain untouched? What loyalties would still be clean? Then came Camilla's remarks. Some interpreted them as practical. Others heard something stronger, an attempt to define her role with firmer edges, to make clear that her position beside the king came with influence that could not simply be dismissed. But in that room, surrounded by people who had lived their entire lives under the heavy discipline of royal hierarchy, even the slightest suggestion of overreach could strike like thunder. Anne's silence before leaving allegedly carried more weight than any spoken rebuke because it denied the room the comfort of argument. There was no shouting to dismiss, no emotional outburst to explain away, no single sentence that could be softened by palace language later. There was only the unbearable stillness of a princess who had heard enough, judged enough, and decided that remaining seated would say the wrong thing. And once Anne crossed that threshold, the question was no longer whether tensions existed, it became whether the monarchy had just witnessed the beginning of an internal reckoning. Insiders claim Camilla's remarks were measured, calm, and wrapped in the language of concern, but to Princess Anne, they landed like an intrusion into sacred ground. Different accounts describe Camilla referencing household unity, future planning, and the need for clear voices around the king. Yet the old guard reportedly heard something else entirely, a quiet attempt to place personal influence beside constitutional duty, and that was where Anne drew the line. The phrase itself may have sounded harmless to anyone outside the palace. Clear voices. Stability. Protection. Words chosen carefully, polished until they seemed impossible to challenge. But inside those walls, language is never just language. Every phrase carries weight. Every sentence can become a signal of territory. And when Camilla reportedly spoke of the need for trusted voices around King Charles during a difficult period, some in the room allegedly felt the temperature shift, as if the conversation had moved from care into command. For Camilla's defenders, the meaning was simple. They believed she was speaking as a wife who had watched the king face pressure, pain, and uncertainty while the nation waited for reassurance. To them, her remarks were not political. They were protective. They saw a woman trying to steady the man beside her, trying to make sure the palace did not become divided at the very moment Charles needed calm around him. In their view, she was not reaching for power. She was trying to prevent disorder. But Anne's supporters reportedly saw the matter through a far older lens. They believed there was a line that even love could not cross. A monarch can be cared for privately, but the crown cannot be guided privately. That distinction, to Anne, was everything. Because once household loyalty begins to shape institutional direction, the balance becomes dangerous. Decisions no longer appear to come from duty alone. They seem to pass through personal circles first, touched by preference, softened by emotion, and protected by proximity. That was why the words "clear voices around the king" allegedly troubled senior aides. Who would decide which voices were clear? Who would be pushed aside as noise? And who would gain the quiet privilege of reaching Charles before others did? Those questions did not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. They settled over the room with a heaviness that could not be disguised by polite expressions or controlled breathing. Prince William was said to be watchful, not because he wished to take sides in a family dispute, but because he understood how quickly blurred authority could become a threat to the future. He had spent years learning that monarchy survives through order, not sentiment. If influence around the king became uncertain now, then the next reign could inherit not strength, but confusion. And confusion inside a palace is never harmless. It invites rivalry. It feeds whispers. It turns loyalty into suspicion. Anne, according to those close to her, did not need a public confrontation to make her judgment known. Her silence was sharper than interruption. Her restraint was colder than anger. She allegedly heard enough to believe that the issue was no longer about comfort around Charles, but about the invisible boundary between the king's private life and the crown's public command. And when that boundary began to feel threatened, Anne responded in the only language the palace truly understands: action without explanation. Because for Anne, this was not about one sentence, one meeting, or one uncomfortable exchange. It was about whether the crown would be guarded by duty or softened by private influence. Princess Anne has never needed spectacle to make a statement. Reports suggest she simply stood, gathered herself with the cold precision of someone who had already made her decision, and left the room without turning back. There was no raised voice, no dramatic accusation, no public declaration. And that, insiders whisper, made the act even more devastating. Because Anne's refusal to remain seated became a silent veto against everything she believed had gone too far. For those who have watched Anne across decades of royal pressure, the meaning was impossible to miss. She is not a woman moved by passing discomfort. She does not retreat because a conversation becomes unpleasant. She does not abandon duty because the atmosphere grows tense. That is why her exit reportedly struck the room with such force. It suggested that, in her mind, remaining there would have meant giving quiet approval to a discussion she believed had already crossed into dangerous territory. Seasoned palace staff were said to be stunned, not because Anne was unpredictable, but because she was exactly the opposite. Her discipline is part of her legend. Her loyalty to the crown has been forged through years of scandal, grief, criticism, and family rupture. She has endured storms that would have broken weaker figures, and she has done so without demanding sympathy. So when she allegedly chose silence over debate, the message became sharper than any confrontation could have been. She was not leaving because she had lost control. She was leaving because she had taken control of what her presence meant. That was what made the moment so powerful. By staying, Anne might have allowed the discussion to continue under the comfort of royal normality. By sitting in that room, she might have appeared to legitimize the very conversation she reportedly found troubling. But by walking out, she withdrew that legitimacy. She denied the table the shield of her participation. And in palace language, where gestures often matter more than words, that withdrawal was a warning carved in ice. King Charles was reportedly caught in the most painful position of all, pulled between loyalty to his wife and respect for the sister who had stood beside the monarchy through some of its darkest seasons. Charles knows Anne's value. He knows her strength. He knows that she is not easily offended and never casually dramatic. But he also knows Camilla's role in his life, the emotional support she has provided, and the quiet reliance that has grown stronger during his vulnerable period. In that frozen moment, the king was not simply managing a meeting. He was facing the private cost of a public crown. Camilla's circle, according to whispers, was deeply unsettled by Anne's move. because it could not be easily dismissed. Had Anne spoken harshly, they might have called it emotion. Had she challenged Camilla directly, they might have framed it as personal tension. But silence is harder to spin. A walkout leaves no quote to soften, no phrase to clarify, no apology to negotiate. It becomes a symbol, and symbols travel faster than explanations. Among the old guard, the moment allegedly became known as the beginning of the Anne line, a boundary no one could pretend had not been drawn. It was not written in protocol, not announced through official channels, not sealed with ceremony. But it existed. It meant that certain matters, certain powers, and certain private influences could not pass unchallenged simply because the monarchy was under pressure. Anne had reminded everyone that duty was not decoration. It was a wall. But Anne's departure did not end the matter. It transformed a private disagreement into a coded palace warning that every senior royal instantly understood. Those familiar with palace dynamics suggest Prince William did not need anyone to explain what had happened. Anne's walkout was not merely personal displeasure. It was a signal from the monarchy's most disciplined survivor that the boundaries of power were being tested. William, already carrying the burden of the future crown, reportedly recognized the danger immediately. When old loyalties fracture inside a royal room, the heir does not hear noise, he hears history preparing to repeat itself. For William, the moment allegedly carried a weight that went beyond family discomfort. He had lived long enough inside the monarchy to understand that real crises rarely arrive with public announcements. They begin quietly, in private conversations, in small shifts of access, in the subtle reshaping of who speaks first and who is expected to remain silent. Anne's departure, therefore, was not just an emotional reaction. It was a warning flare from someone who had spent her life defending the institution from weakness, vanity, and drift. The future king reportedly understood that Anne's concern matched his own deeper fear, that the monarchy must remain disciplined, duty first, and resistant to private pressure, especially during a period when King Charles's health had made the inner circle more important than ever. A vulnerable monarch creates a vacuum around him, even when no one admits it. Into that vacuum come advisors, relatives, households, loyalists, and quiet ambitions. Some arrive with love, some arrive with strategy, and some may not even realize when concern begins to look like control. That was the danger William allegedly saw forming beneath the surface. If the crown's authority could appear blurred now, even slightly, then every future decision risked being questioned. Was it the king's will? Was it the household's influence? Was it Camilla's preference? Was it the old guard resisting change? Once those questions take root, trust becomes fragile, and a monarchy built on continuity begins to tremble from within. Some insiders claim Prince Edward quietly understood Anne's interpretation of events, even if he did not move with the same sharp finality. Edward has often lived in the quieter corners of royal duty, but silence does not mean blindness. He reportedly recognized the same tension Anne had sensed, the split between personal loyalty and constitutional restraint. Camilla could be loved, respected, and protected as the king's wife, but the moment her influence appeared to shape royal command, the room changed. The issue was no longer emotion, it became structure. And structure is everything to William. His future depends on a monarchy that does not bend according to private loyalties, because one day he will inherit not only the crown, but every unresolved fracture hidden beneath it. Anne's walkout allegedly forced him to look harder at household boundaries, at who held access, at how decisions were being filtered, and at whether the palace was allowing comfort to become authority. Those questions were not easy, because they touched the most sensitive nerve in royal life, the difference between family and monarchy. Camilla's role after Anne's exit reportedly came under sharper scrutiny, not because everyone believed she had acted with ambition, but because perception can be just as dangerous as intent. In royal politics, what people think they see often matters more than what was meant. Her defenders may have called her protective, But Anne's supporters saw the moment as proof that the institution needed firmer walls. William, standing between present loyalty and future responsibility, allegedly began to understand that neutrality might not be enough. And as the heir began to absorb the consequences, the palace found itself facing a dangerous reality. Anne had not simply walked out, she had forced everyone else to choose where they stood. King Charles, according to various palace interpretations, was left in the cruelest position of all. On one side stood Camilla, the woman who had waited decades to be recognized beside him. On the other stood Anne, the sister who had served the crown with unforgiving discipline long before popularity, sympathy, or personal comfort mattered. Reports suggest Charles understood the walkout instantly, because Anne's anger was never careless. When she moved, it was because the crown itself felt endangered. For a moment, the king reportedly tried to steady what had become unsteady. That is what monarchs are trained to do. They absorb shock. They soften rupture. They turn conflict into procedure before anyone outside the room can sense the damage. But this time, the fracture was too personal and too symbolic to be smoothed over by calm words. Anne had not merely left a discussion. She had removed the weight of her approval, and Charles knew the difference. His health struggles made the confrontation even more painful. At a time when the palace needed unity, strength, and careful coordination, the meeting had exposed the very uncertainty everyone was trying to hide. Charles was not only a king managing a reign under pressure. He was a husband, a brother, and a father standing at the center of competing loyalties. Every choice risked wounding someone, every silence risked empowering someone, and every attempt to remain balanced made the burden heavier. Camilla's defenders reportedly believed Anne had humiliated the Queen unnecessarily. To them, Camilla had spoken from concern, not ambition. They argued that after years of criticism, judgment, and delayed acceptance, she had earned the right to protect Charles in the way only someone closest to him could. They saw Anne's exit as cold, even cruel, a public-private rebuke delivered at the worst possible moment. In their eyes, the Queen had been wounded for trying to bring order to a difficult period. But Anne's allies believed the opposite. They reportedly felt Charles needed to confront a reality he had avoided for too long. Affection cannot be allowed to blur authority. Camilla could stand beside him, support him, and share his private battles. But the machinery of monarchy could not appear to pass through her household or depend on her circle. The crown, they believed, must never look as though it is being guided by closeness rather than constitutional discipline. And Anne's walkout forced that uncomfortable truth into the open. That was why senior figures allegedly urged Charles to contain the dispute before it became public rumor. Palace history has shown again and again that once a family disagreement escapes into whispers, it mutates. A glance becomes a feud. A silence becomes a verdict. A closed-door exchange becomes proof of something darker. Charles reportedly understood the danger, but he also understood that this moment would not disappear simply because no official statement acknowledged it. The deeper concern was not about one conversation. It was about who speaks with authority when the monarch is vulnerable. When the king's health becomes part of the national mood, every person near him gains significance. Every advisor becomes more visible. Every household decision carries political weight. And if senior royals begin to question whether authority is flowing through the proper channels, then the palace faces a problem far more dangerous than embarrassment. Charles, caught between love and duty, allegedly tried to hold the center. But the center had already shifted. Anne had made sure of that. Her silence had become a challenge, her absence a warning, and her loyalty a weapon sharpened by decades of service. Camilla may have remained in the room, but Anne's departure was the thing everyone continued to feel. Yet the more Charles tried to contain the fallout, the more the walkout became impossible to bury, because silence inside the palace often speaks louder than any statement released to the public. By the following hours, insiders whisper, the palace machinery had already begun to move. Calendars were reviewed. Guest lists were reconsidered. Private secretaries exchanged careful messages that said little on paper, but carried enormous meaning between the lines. Nothing official was announced, and nothing was admitted. But within the invisible architecture of royal power, Anne's walkout reportedly triggered a quiet audit of access, influence, and who had been allowed too close to the king's inner decisions. No one inside the palace needed a public statement to understand what had changed. The silence itself became the statement. Palace aides reportedly began looking again at communication channels, at who carried messages, who entered private discussions, and whose voice had been treated as essential during Charles's vulnerable period. Camilla's household, once protected by closeness to the king, was said to feel newly watched by senior courtiers who understood that Anne's departure had not been an emotional outburst, but a line drawn with brutal precision. To Anne's supporters, this was not revenge. It was not bitterness. It was bureaucratic warfare in its coldest form, a quiet struggle over whether the crown would remain governed by duty or softened by personal influence. William and Edward allegedly favoured clearer boundaries around royal decision-making, not to humiliate Camilla, but to protect the monarchy from uncertainty. Because once people begin asking who truly speaks for the king, the palace has already entered dangerous ground. And so the phrase "the Anne line" reportedly began to move through private conversations, becoming shorthand for institutional resistance. It meant there were limits. It meant loyalty to Charles did not require surrendering the structure around him. It meant Camilla could be respected as queen, but not allowed to become the unseen filter through which royal command appeared to pass. Public silence only deepened the speculation, because the more the palace refused to explain, the more powerful Anne's absence became. In the end, the story was never just about Camilla speaking or Anne leaving. It was about a monarchy under pressure, a king weakened by illness, an heir watching the future narrow before him, and an old guard refusing to let private influence blur the sacred lines of duty. Reports suggest Anne's walkout became a warning carved into palace memory. The crown may bend for family, but it must never kneel to it. Charles was forced to confront the emotional cost of divided loyalty. Camilla's influence reportedly faced new resistance. William's future role grew more central, not because he demanded power, but because stability now required firmer hands and clearer rules. The old guard emerged not as relics of the past, but as defenders of restraint, tradition, and the invisible discipline that keeps monarchy from becoming family politics in a crown. Because in the House of Windsor, power is rarely seized with shouting, it is often reclaimed through silence, absence, and one unforgiving step toward the door. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.